Welcome to the Fit Strong Women Over 50 podcast, episode number 140. Hi, everyone. I'm Jill. Thank you for joining us.
And I'm Chris. Jill and I are the hosts for this podcast and the founders of the Becoming Ellie community. Today, we're talking with Elizabeth Emery about amazing female athletes.
After talking with Elizabeth, I'm paying more attention to how people talk about women in sports.
Jill, before we get into the interview with Elizabeth, we should explain why we're called Becoming Ellie.
Good idea. We decided to name our community Becoming Ellie because Ellie was the Norse goddess of aging who beat Thor in a wrestling match. Chris and I thought, hey, we want to be like Ellie.
You can find out more about the Becoming Ellie community and this podcast at our website, becomingellie.com. And Ellie is spelled E-L-L-I.
Be sure to sign up for our newsletter while you're there. That way you'll know about new episodes and anything else that's new with us. Let's go to the podcast. Elizabeth Emery is a former professional cyclist, U.S. national champion, and Pan Am Games gold medalist who raced in the women's Tour de France for many years when it was called the Grand Boucle. She won the U.S. time trial national championship, a gold medal in the Pan American Games, the Pan American Championships, and the Tour of Japan.
Wow. Elizabeth is the host of podcast Hear Her Sports, where female athletes share stories of the amazing things that they're doing.
Welcome, Elizabeth. It's great to get to talk with you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
You have an amazing bio as a professional athlete. How many years were you a professional athlete?
I did that for 10 years.
10 years. Wow.
Correct. Yeah. And a lot of that was traveling overseas, certainly racing nationally as well. Yeah.
So what was it like racing in the race that's now called the Tour de France?
Oh my gosh, it is so hard, so hard. It's hard to explain the difficulty of racing for that long. When I did it, it was close to 2 weeks, not quite. And, just the exhaustion that you feel. I remember waking up every morning and, you would get out of bed and you would go to the hotel breakfast place. And I love food. I love to eat. And I would just sit there and look at the food by the second week and think, oh, I can't do this. And and fueling. I mean, we know so much more about fueling now than, we ever have. And the importance of fueling and making sure that you're getting enough food for the duration of the race is so important. And the thing that happens, when you're racing back to back, it compounds the amount of fuel that you need, like you can't keep up with it every day. And so you're always behind. And so it was really something you had to eat. And it was awful. So that was one thing I really remember. Right. And yeah, it really is hard to explain how, for those of us who are in the States, how hard it is to race up those Alps mountains, like all the iconic race mountains that the men are doing, the Tourmalet, the Alpe d'Huez and all that stuff. They're just long. They are long and they are steep and they're hard. And, I'm not particularly a climber, so it was always memorable to not be doing well on those hills.
So you did, because you did the time trials, so you did both basically short races and long.
Sure. I really love the stage racing because I love the tactics of it. And at that time for women's racing, we did have quite a few longer stage races. Like, a big one in the States was the Tour of Idaho. It had a number of different names, but that was put on by a guy named Jim Rabdow, who just was, I think back to what a leader he was. He decided that he wanted to put on this big, long race and decided that women could do it no matter what the rules were. In fact, he was not a big, the U.S. Federation did not love him and the UCI did not love him because he was going against a lot of the rules because they were sort of the mindset that the uterus were going to fall out if we raced too many days in a row.
You needed to be protected.
Exactly. So he was like, that's not the reality. So he would have us do these really long races. And so that was fun. And there was a Tour de Load over in Europe. And anyway, so I did those, but yes, I also did time trials. Sort of the standard iconic is 40 kilometers, but often it's less than that.
When did you retire?
It was 2001, I think. I stopped racing internationally after the Olympics that year in Sydney and decided to race locally for a year and see how that was. And I really enjoyed mostly racing with a team and the tactics of team tactics. And locally, there just aren't enough women. At that time, there was not enough women to sort of be able to do that effectively.
And so what did you do after you retired, athletically speaking?
Athletically speaking, this and that mostly. I became a slug and went to school for a while.
Okay.
So that took up a lot of time. And then, one day, so we ended up moving to Cleveland after that whole period. And I was bringing my commuter bike up from the basement and I could barely carry it. And I thought, oh, we have really dipped low. So it was time to get back to things. So I started training a little more seriously. And that was in around, I guess, 2009 or something like that.
So do you still cycle or have you taken up a new sport?
Well, I do cycle. I still run and I cross-country ski, but I have recently taken up a new sport, squash, which I found in February, and I absolutely love it. It's so different from any other sport that I've ever done in, like just a myriad of ways. Mentally, it's just super different than, individual endurance sport. It also is in an enclosed space, so it really challenges sense of space and, spatial awareness and tactics. It also is, since for about 10 years, I've been fascinated by competition. During doing the podcast, I've talked to so many women about their competitive life. And I started having questions about, why do you want to compete rather than just doing your sport? Like, what is it about competition that excites you? And I couldn't relate to it anymore because as an older athlete, often we do masters events and everybody starts on the same line, regardless of your age. And so it's mostly a time trial. Like if you do a marathon, you're trying to race your best. It's mostly a time trial, it's a time trial. And I missed that sort of mano a mano combat and, really duking it out and facing the other person for competition. And that's what squash is. You're on the court with one other person and you have to figure it out. And honestly, I'm not the greatest competitor. And so this has been an amazing, wonderful challenge to figure out. It's also just, as older athletes, I think it's so important that we challenge ourselves and try something new and, develop new skills. And particularly for me, all of my sports are so lateral. Cycling is on one plane, running is on one plane. I do skate ski, so that has some lateral movement. But, the squash court is a whole different ball game. And I think it's going to help me in the end is, be a better person, have greater longevity. So I'm really excited about it. It also has an incredible intensity. And I'm sure you guys have talked to a lot of people who talk about how important intensity is as we age.
Is that what keeps you motivated to keep training, the intensity, or what motivates you to keep training?
Well, I just love it. And yeah. So above all else, I just love being outdoors, which squash is not, but I love being outdoors. I love physical movement. I love learning. There's something about sport where you're always trying to get better. You're never going to be great, or the greatest, or, even the greatest person is not the greatest. There's always ways to improve. And I just love that. I love trying to figure things out. So there's that. And yeah, a lot of it is just longevity. I want to be able to, travel for as long as I can, walk around with health for as long as I can. I want to be able to do my groceries, lift things up and down. So there's certainly that. And then, again, we talked about the intensity, and I think it helps the brain. On the podcast, I talked to Angie Rigel, who talks about the importance of movement and how it stimulates the brain, keeps us smart, keeps our memory going, and all that stuff. It's just, it's fantastic.
That's cool. And it's interesting that you mentioned Angie because we interviewed her a couple times on the podcast. So, her work with the brain and exercise and how that all is. And I'll reference that in our show notes too, because it's really interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I recently read a book, and I'm not going to be able to quote it. I can get it to you so that you can put it in the show notes. But it's about how important movement is for mental health, and in a way where she talks about the chemicals. There's actual science that she's done the research, and it's about, certainly it's about endorphins, but it's all about other stuff. And for me, I know that because, recently I've been injured and I haven't been able to exercise as much as I had been. And I'm not getting the endorphins that I'm used to. And I notice the difference. I totally notice the difference.
It's amazing, isn't it? Tell us about your podcast, Hear Her Sports. What prompted you to start it, and what exactly, I guess, what's your topic theme?
I talk to female athletes, and it's about a lot of different things. Originally, I thought, I'm just going to talk to female athletes. I had been listening to a lot of talk radio leading up to the Cavaliers winning the national championships. Well, actually, it was their first go at it when they didn't win. So I was listening to a lot of talk radio, and I was learning so much about basketball. I do love basketball. I follow it, but I didn't know a ton of it. But listening to this talk radio, I just learned so much. I learned about all the players. I learned about tactics, and I learned about the other players, their competition. And I thought somebody should have a radio show like this for women. And sort of that was the beginning.
Somebody meaning you.
Right. I realized no one was going to do it except for me. And this was in 2006. So it's been quite a while now. And so, and I thought leading up to it, I thought, okay, so what would I want to hear from women? And initially it was just, I'm going to hear about their sports, and it's going to be, we'll talk about sports, we'll talk about coaching, we'll talk about training. And very early on, I realized that I was opening up or building a gigantic web, because for me, it has become a way to talk about equity in sports, and equity in sports is just a mirror of equity everywhere else. And an early guest, it was episode 27 with Shelma Junn, and she is a climber, and she founded Flash Foxy. And the reason she founded Flash Foxy is in climbing, in rock climbing, there's this thing called beta. And men tend to give women beta, and unwanted beta. And what beta is telling them how to do it. And so, she would be climbing, and men would come over and tell her what to do. And she knew totally what to do. She was an expert climber. But apparently it's this thing that happens all the time, which I can totally relate to. Men cyclists hate it when I am faster than they are, blah, blah. We all know about that. And so she started this thing, which initially was just an Instagram feed, and she wanted to build a community. So she built this community, and it just absolutely exploded. I mean, she ended up starting weekend climbing workshops, which filled up in like literally minutes. So there's all these people doing these great things. But this episode, she talked about equity in a way that just everybody should listen to that episode. It's just so amazing. And one of the things she talks about is people got mad at her for bringing politics into climbing. They were like, why are you bringing politics into climbing? I don't want politics in my climbing. And she was like, that's great for you that you can do that. But for me, because I'm a woman and men are stamping on me, giving me beta, politics is already in my climbing. And so that was a real lesson for me. Politics is already in my sports because I'm a woman, because of equity issues in sport for women, long time. So there's no avoiding it. And it was really interesting. I would say that 99% of my guests, in addition to doing their sport, doing their training, whatever it is, they have this side job of promoting sports for women. All the guests that I have are so aware of where they fit in history. They understand the women who came before them. They want to promote it for the women who are going to come after. And it's super important. They dedicate a ton of time to it.
Wow.
So that's episode 27 of Hear Her Sports.
Correct.
Yeah. Well, we'll put a link to that as well.
Please. And, the other thing I discovered is that there's so many other women in sports than the athletes. So there's coaches and nutritionists and, leaders in different organizations. And so I ended up speaking to them as well.
Yeah, you talk to a lot of women who are doing amazing things in all kinds of sports. And would you say there's anything that they have in common, regardless of the sport?
I have learned I did a presentation of the 7 things I've learned, 7 lessons from the podcast, and I won't go through all of them. But so one of the commonalities is that a lot of the women grew up competing with men. And that was because of a lot of different reasons. One, like I had one athlete from Alaska, and there are so few kids. So to make a team, they had to be co-ed. So she played with boys. And then a lot of the guests have had brothers who they competed with. They've had fathers that that have brought them through the sports. So that's one commonality. Another commonality is what I just spoke about. They really understand where they fit into history. And what are some of the other commonalities? Oh, well, I think that something I learned recently with a sailor who was on the podcast, that's Sarah Douglas. She's a Canadian sailor. She's aiming for the Paris Olympics. She's aiming to medal in the Paris Olympics. She was at the last Olympics. She talked about having spreadsheets about...
Wow.
I know. So she has spreadsheets about her training. She has spreadsheets about the wind. She has spreadsheets about the current. She has spreadsheets about the time of year. She has spreadsheets about the cloud cover and all of this stuff. And it reminded me how detailed athletes are. I mean, athletes at the top level are not messing around. They are doing the coolest things to be on top of their sport and get everything that they can out of it. And I think that was something that I learned when I was in cycling. I had never cared so much about anything prior to doing that. And so I tried to get everything I could out of myself, knowing about nutrition and training and this and that. And it wasn't casual.
Yeah.
Is there anything in common that the female athletes in how they train? Is there something maybe it was even just all the prep work that you just talked about, but is there some sort of common trait that you see in the actual training?
The dedication, but every sport is so different.
Right.
I think strength training is really interesting to me because, like history of female strength training is that we were encouraged not to do it,
right.
Don't look muscly, you're going to look too manly or, whatever it is. And I have had a lot of guests saying that that's how they initially felt about strength training and soon learned that was sort of not an issue, and they loved having that strength. So I would say basically everybody strength trains.
And do you ask people about how they eat, how they fuel, anything about that kind of thing? And is there any sort of common denominator in that?
Interesting. I do ask them, but I love talking about food. It's super interesting.
I do too. That's why I'm wondering if.
Oh, really? Yeah. I would say that the only commonality is that they care. I think we all have agreed that nutrition is super important. I was just talking to a friend about this. There's so much we don't know about nutrition. It's so hard to study, like how do you study what you put in your body and keep track of it? It's all, like you're not going to lock somebody in a room and only give them a certain amount of food. It's just not going to work. So studies are really problematic, but we do know that it's super important. And I would say that, like we talk about commonalities, one issue that I think is really important right now is Red S, which we used to be known as the female athlete triad, which is basically not fueling enough. And we talked about that initially when I was talking about the Tour de France. And I think women are becoming more and more aware of how important it is to eat properly. And this whole idea of fast and lean is a myth. Sure, I understand the, power to weight ratio, but there's also health. There's need to be to have the longevity and be able to continue on. And I think it's interesting too. I think, it's now become clear that men are doing that. Again, cycling's my sport. There are so many men in the pro peloton that I would wonder if they're not eating enough. And I think that's one thing that's really exciting for me to see how things are changing in women's sports. Again, because I'm a cyclist, I follow it, but the number of teams, pro teams, women's teams that have nutritionists on staff is really growing. And it is because they are trying to optimize. And to optimize, you have to have some expertise. And you can't expect the athletes to have that necessarily.
Most of us, unless you're a nutrition or a dietitian, you know, all right, I can enter my food in a food app and it'll tell me whatever it is I'm eating, but that's not the same as actually planning how you're going to eat in advance of some big race.
Yeah, or even those apps aren't going to understand if you're, you know, putting in the hours that those cyclists are putting in, or even, you know, a casual person training for a triathlon, you know, Ironman.
Right.
The amount of calories those people need, it's unfathomable. And for, you know, like there's been a lot of discussion about intuitive eating. And, you know, on one hand, yes, I think that is a really good way to think about it. However, stress really messes with your intuition about food. Lack of sleep messes with it. You know, intensity of training messes with it. So you can't rely on it 100%. I also know that for me, when I'm leading up to some sort of competition, I get very nervous and my desire to eat goes down.
The butterflies.
So, right. So, you know, for the week prior, when I'm needing to particularly pay attention to fuel, I'm not wanting to eat. So I can't do it by intuition.
Well, our listeners are women over 50 who are interested in being fit and strong as they age. And most of us are not professionals, but what kind of lessons will we learn from the women that you talk with? What are the takeaways?
Well, you know, I love talking to the older women that I talk to. I recently spoke to Barb Broad, who is also local to us, and she is a marathon runner, and she is a multi-time Boston age group winner. She is currently coming back from an injury, and she told me she was running like 950 miles, which is fast.
Yeah,
you know, and she's 73. And, you know, for me, for her to be still active and still running, and yes, she's dealing with injury, but she's still at it. So talking to her, people like her just gives me inspiration, you know, that it is possible to continue and to be healthy and also to be competitive. You know, I think it's easy for us to look, how do I want to say this? It's easy for us to look at current examples of older people and say, oh, you can't do it because, you know, for so many decades, we've been told that older people can't do certain things. And, you know, I think it's too bad that we fall into that false expectation. And then if we see people like Barb Broad, we know, okay, no, we can continue to run. We can continue to be strong and active. And she's still running. She's still strength training. So I really like hearing stories like that. But the truth is, I also really like hearing from the younger women. And, you know, for example, the sailor I mentioned who's making spreadsheets, you know, just knowing what I have to do if I want to be serious at my sport. And I don't have to be aiming to go to the Olympics to be serious about my sport. I can be 60 and still be serious about my sport.
Yeah.
And I think that's important to know what it takes, the dedication that it takes. And then I also really like talking to younger athletes. I recently spoke to a woman wrestler. She also from Ohio. I'm doing all these Ohio things today. So she's I'm going to mess up the name, but the Ohio High School Athletic Association last year finally officially sanctioned female wrestling state championships. And this woman, Jaden McKinney, just won last year the first state championship in her weight bracket. And she was amazing to talk to. And I just thought, you are the hope. I mean, she was amazing. I mean, she was talking to me about Red S, and I thought, how does a 15-year-old know about Red S? This is fantastic. And you know, I talked about how we're so aware of our history and our place in history, and just to see what is coming up just makes me so excited. And I think what we can learn is that, you know, we are making a difference.
I noticed that even just in the gym, that, you know, talk about when we were in school, or certainly not encouraged to lift weights, but when I go in the gym now, I just love to sit and watch the young women come in who just are gorgeous with muscle, and they're not requiring anyone to tell them what to do. They just come in and are doing things. That is just so fantastic. I just enjoy watching them.
Yeah, I do too. I remember when I first started weightlifting, I was always the only woman in the group.
Yes. And when I first started weightlifting, I would wander in, and because I was older than most of the men in the weight room and I was just sort of doing my thing, they didn't care. They didn't care at all that I was there. Nobody said, "Why are you here? Get out." They just sort of ignored me, and that was fine. It was a shock. It was a surprise to me at the time.
I really encourage women to strength train. I think it's great. It's super great. And Angie
has
talks
so
about
many
that
benefits.
a lot.
Yes,
right?
she's really into the heavy lifting. And it was a young man who told me it was time to start actually lifting weights. It was a trainer at the gym that I was going to at the time and took me into the area and showed me what to do, and I was so nervous at the time, but it was like one of the best gifts that anyone has ever given me, really.
Yeah. Had you avoided it prior?
I was using machines and things in the gym. It never occurred to me that I could venture into that area. They had it all, their free weights were in a separate part of the gym.
Sure. Yeah.
And so it did not seem like a place where I would go.
I think that's another thing I've really enjoyed about having the podcast is, basically every other week I talk to another female athlete, and it makes me realize that there's a whole community out there of sporty women who are like me, who enjoy being physically fit, who enjoy the movement, who enjoy the process. And, what a gift. I have an opportunity to talk to them and ask them questions about whatever I'm thinking about that week. And I think listeners, I hope that listeners can get the same thing. Obviously, they're not asking the questions, but, I would hope that they would get that same sense of community by listening and hearing us talk about these topics surrounding sports and that lifestyle.
Part of your motivation for your podcast was the lack of coverage of women's sports in the media. Like there is
thank you for thanks for reminding me about
that. There is no talk radio for women's sports. Well, I'm going to ask you sort of a silly question. Why do you think that is? That there's not much coverage of women?
Oh my gosh, that is such a complicated question. Wow. It is so, I don't know. I think it's there are a lot of reasons. You could see me stumbling over this. One, it's a lot of it is money. And in recent episodes, I've talked to guests about that, about sort of why are we seeing this just record numbers of audience for professional women's sporting events, like in soccer and basketball and even volleyball. Why is the money not following? It's just mysterious to me. And I think a lot of it is because, I talked about this with Kate Ackerman, who runs a Boston women's sports hospital. I'm totally bastardizing the name. Sorry about that. It's because the boardrooms of big companies, Nike, Brooks, blah, 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 they're all men or mostly men. And so when somebody comes and says, hey, we got to do this for women, they're all like, I don't get it. Like, why? Isn't there enough equity? And so that is a huge problem. And that's true also in newspapers. The sports editors are all men. And so even if there are women sports writers, if they go to the editors and say, hey, this would be a great story, the sports editor is often going to say, why? I don't get it. Who would be interested in that? And so that definitely needs to change, like who's at the top.
I think probably sports editors assume that their readers are men.
Yeah.
But don't they do audience surveys? I mean, don't they know how much, the viewers are growing, the numbers of women that watch? Don't they realize that? I mean, they've got to study that.
You would think. I also think that we have not, and I include myself in that, is that we have not totally come to a conclusion of what women want in terms of following sports. I personally don't like the stats, but I think data is super important. I mean, that's one of the big issues right now in women's sports is there just is not enough data. So, for example, if you go to a baseball game, they're going to be talking about, oh my gosh, that's the third best hit and whatever. I don't even know.
And baseball is nothing but statistics. So
right. But even in basketball, when you're comparing the women to men, you can't compare the women you can't compare to the women to the men and, like in terms of 3-point shooting and all that stuff, because the stats haven't been kept. I don't think they're still being kept. I mean, anyway, and then I recently had a woman reach out to me because she wants ESPN to keep track of collegiate women's soccer stats, and she's having trouble. They do it for the men and you can find it online, but for the women, you can't.
I hadn't thought about the stats.
I forgot why I talked about stats.
So it's the stats of the physical play, but not the number of viewers. And
correct.
It's not that the women aren't competing enough. It's just that they aren't keeping track of it. Is that right? I mean, do I have that?
Well, so the stats I was talking about is just like how many 3-point shots each of the players are getting. And in the men, they do keep track of that.
So in basketball, going back to basketball for a minute, you can easily have the argument with a basketball fan about, was Michael Jordan better than LeBron? People have that argument all the time, and they can pull out all the stats on all of the games and how many field goals they made and whatever they did. You can actually discuss it and people who are really into that have that all at their fingertips and will have a very impassioned argument about it.
Yes. Thank you. You explained that way better than I did. Appreciate
it. You can't do that for women's sports because do you know who if we watch the WNBA now, we can see who the best players are, but we don't know even who they were 20 years ago. And so we cannot actually have that discussion because who knows? Who knows what they were doing? Though I will say my father was a big sports person and he loved any sport, but he always said women's basketball had the biggest change of any sport he had ever seen in his lifetime, because when he was in school, girls were not allowed to play full court basketball. They were only allowed to play half court basketball.
That's hard to imagine, isn't it?
It is. So he met when he was doing volunteer work somewhere, and he met this young girl, high school girl, and he said, he recognized her name. He said, "Are you the basketball player that I keep reading about in the paper?" And she said, sort of shyly, "Yes, that's me." And he told her that, and she said, "Wow, do you have any video of that?"
Oh my gosh.
He was like, "Unfortunately, no." But just talking about women's basketball made me think of that because it is hard to imagine that they wouldn't allow the girls to run up and down the whole court.
Yeah. Their uterus would have fallen out.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
But, it's also interesting to think about commentators and how they cover men's sports versus women's sports. And there's been studies about it. Cheryl Cookie was on the podcast talking about that. But I watch a lot of sports and the coverage is different. And I think a lot of it is simply because they don't know the history of the women's sport. And so it's just harder for them to talk about it intelligently. And, I notice that more and more there are sports that are, the event happens at the same time. So cyclocross, the men's and women's events happen in the same weekend. Often the elite level is the same day. Cross-country skiing happens on the same day, men and women. Biathlon, so shooting and skiing happens on the same day. And so the coverage of those sports, the commentators have to be good at both.
Yes.
And they are getting better and better. And you can see it.
So I watch sometimes video TV coverage of triathlons, Ironman or whatever, whether it's on YouTube or wherever. And because they race at the same time or at the same day, the men and the women, they cover both. But there seems to be, and I'm not sure whether it becomes from the athletes or themselves or the commentators, there always seems to be more drama about the male athletes, that they're very big on sort of finding competition between them, whereas the women seem to be much more, compatible with, or not necessarily that they're not competitive, but they don't talk smack to each other, I guess is what it is. The competition, that whatever between the men, gives the competitors or the commentators a lot more things to talk about. They like talking about the human aspect of it, whereas the women...
The video that has legs is where the woman helps someone else who has been having trouble at the cost of her own time.
Yes. Look, Danielle
Right.
Riff stopped to pick up something for somebody. Not that she would do that, but that kind of thing. It's just part of it is I wonder how much, what role do you think women have in all of this? It's not just that the commentators don't know, but maybe it's behavior. I don't know.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. With TV, it's always hard. What's actually happening and what are you showing me?
Right.
And, the Cheryl Cookie study, one of the things that she's the person that came up with the 4%, that only 4% of sports media coverage is about women. So that stat is, everybody knows that. But in addition to studying the quantity, she also studied the quality of sports coverage. And she discovered that, when commentators were talking about men's sports, they used different, very exciting words. Their voices were different and like super ebullient and emotive and, like big, powerful, strong words. And when they were talking about women's sports, it was a whole different thing. It was very subdued and they seemed bored. And I've heard it myself on sports coverage that I watch when I listen to the men and then the women. It's sort of like, why would I listen to this? If I were not interested in this sport simply because I'm interested in, I would never return to this coverage. I would just not, I would think the sport was boring. Yeah, it's a huge problem. And I know it's not because the actual event and the women athletes are boring. It's because of the way it's being discussed.
Okay. And that's probably more to the point.
Yeah. And I mean, in women's cycling, for example, a lot of the men's coverage is now from the start of the race to the end of the race. And the women's races are covered for I think they assume the last hour. So whatever number of kilometers that is. And often the exciting bit happens in the front. And if that doesn't coincide with what they've decided to put on TV, you miss all the exciting bit.
So they have only so many cameras covering an
Correct.
event. They cover when the men start or whatever. They might show you women taking off because they're often after, and then they move everything. And so they're not even around to cover the women as they're racing.
I think there's some requirements. If you're a certain level of race, you have to have a certain amount of TV coverage. And most of the races do just the bare minimum. And I don't know the exact details, and I think it may be 1 hour or 2 hours. And so they calculate how long they think the women are going to be, how fast they're going to be racing and how long they, like at what kilometer they need to start to get that amount of coverage.
Wow. So the effect of the lack of media means that female athletes make a lot less money.
Oh, sure.
What effect do you think that has on the different sports?
So both in this discussion about media and this new discussion that you're bringing, all of it is what I call this web. It's all so interconnected, as you pointed out, with less specifically TV coverage, because all the sponsors want actual TV coverage. There's less sponsorship dollars. There's less money to teams. And, I think when you first try to wrap your head around what that actually means, you think, oh, they have less money to live, so they're going to live in a less nice house, whatever. But it's so much more complex than that, because it means that they may have to have a second job. And if you have a second job, immediately that changes your training.
Yeah,
and often
into training. Right.
Exactly. And what it cuts into mostly is supportive stuff. So less sleep, less recovery, fewer massages, compromised nutrition, there's all kinds of stuff like that. And then things like what Megan Rapinoe talked about is when she retires, she doesn't have a boatload of money to sort of take several years off, figure out what she's going to do. I mean, she probably has a boatload of money, but most soccer players, when they retire, they have to think about what the next job is. Your average basketball player is not having to rush out and get another job.
No.
Yeah, it's way more complex than that. Than just initially you don't have enough cash in your pocket.
A web is a good way to describe it.
I want to go back a little bit to a previous discussion. We started talking about competition and aggression. And one of the things that I started thinking about a lot was, how we, and I mean that as society, how we perceive aggression is a male version of aggression. Like what we visualize when we say aggressive, somebody's aggressive, they're aggressive on the field. That vision comes from a male athlete. Female aggression doesn't necessarily look like that. do we really know what female aggression looks like?
Well, can you describe it a little bit? How is it different?
Well, I don't know. And I think for every athlete, it's different. One of the athletes I spoke to was Molly Seidel, and she and I had a fantastic discussion about aggression. She's a marathoner. She won an Olympic medal. She is just super amazing. She has this. I also talk a lot about mental health. So she talks about that in the episode. It's another really must listen to. But she was talking about how she doesn't go out and try to pummel her competitors. It's more about her and seeing what she can do. And she's feisty. She is going to do what it takes to get the best placing that she can, but it's not about killing the other person. And I think that's where we haven't quite figured out how to talk about aggression in female athletes. And I think often it is assumed that if a woman does not look like she's pummeling her competition, that she's not aggressive enough. It just might look different than what we're used to.
That's a good point. And so that also goes back to what I was saying about how they talk about
Correct.
each other and part of that is that women are taught from a very young age not to say bad things about, if you don't like someone, just don't say anything,
Right.
Kind of thing. So,
right.
But that's a good point, that it doesn't mean that they're not competitive or aggressive. It's just, it shows up in different ways.
Do you think they're more competitive within themselves, like being competitive against their own stats and things like that, rather than competitive against the other athlete?
I think yeah. I mean, the short answer is yes. And I haven't quite figured out how to sort of describe what the difference is. It hasn't posted yet, but I recently talked to the incredible cross-country skier, Jessie Diggins, and she and I talked about like why she races and what she gets out of racing and what competition looks like for her. And it is all, like what she described was all very personal. It was, she was trying to get the most out of herself. And she is well known for like really going deep, deep, deep. And, so she can do it. And she is very aware of trying to beat her competitors. She wants to win. But at the same time, it's not that pummeling of the other person. It's more pummeling herself.
But also that may depend on the sport, because things like skiing and running, those are all you have to have support. They're individual events.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But if you are on a team, maybe it's a little different. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. But I think about it in squash. Again, one of the reasons I started playing or continued playing squash is that I really like sort of figuring out the competitive aspect. And one of the things I notice is you have to win a point. That's how you win the game, is you win the points. And so you serve the ball, and I find myself, I have to think, okay, I have to win this point. I have to win this point. How am I going to win this point? And it is never about like ruining the other person. It's about understanding their strengths and weaknesses and doing something myself that takes advantage of that. So it's me figuring out the tactics, me figuring out my movement on the court.
That's actually a good point too, because when you're playing squash or any other kind of one-on-one, a direct competition like that, your goal really is not, I want to go out there and make this person sorry they ever saw me, but I want to go out there and win. There's a difference between.
Yeah.
And really, most people, I think, have the goal of, I want to win.
Yeah. So aggression does look different. Being aggressive looks different as a woman competing. It's hard to say.
It's hard to say. Yeah. I mean, I always hesitate making these comparisons and saying, like women are this way or women are that way.
Because it comes very stereotypical, right?
Exactly. And again, who knows if it's socialized? We talk about weightlifting and how, I think it could be viewed that women don't weightlift, but a lot of that is because we were taught for so long that, we shouldn't look like a man.
Yeah. Don't get muscles.
Don't get muscles.
You've mentioned several people during the course of today's interview, and I'm wondering, is there one guest that you've interviewed who just amazed you more than the others? And I know how hard that is to pick one.
Who's your favorite guest?
Yes, who's my favorite guest?
Who's your favorite child?
Right.
Maybe something that sticks out in your mind, things that they said that really stays with you.
Certainly the Shelma Jun episode always stays with me. I think about that episode so often. But I will say that my favorite guest is the last guest.
The last one
or the one that I've most recently spoken to. I mean, let's see. I mean,
they're so different, right?
They're so different. And I think that's why I keep doing it, is I'm always learning something from these women. And it's just amazing to talk to them. Yeah, I'm sort of stumbling over this question. Apologies. But like even just Jaden McKinney, and that was the wrestler, that episode hasn't posted yet. I mean, I learned so much from her. I know that I'm going to keep that episode close to my heart. Just what a fantastic 15-year-old she was.
That's wonderful.
I mean, it blew my mind.
Now that's a sport I'll bet there was some resistance to having girls do, wrestling.
Oh, sure. Yeah, she definitely got into it because I think her dad was a coach, a wrestling coach. So she got into it. She also played football. She was the only girl on the football team for a long time. I also really like talking to, sort of the non, big athletes and, the more local people, just as a reminder to myself and also for listeners that, you don't have to be an Olympian. That's not really the point. The point is, how do you get involved in this activity and learn something from it, become better? Since we've been talking about all these Ohio people, one of the episodes I think about a lot is with Erica Hood. She runs SIAT, which is an organization for Black kids to get them involved in. It started with winter sports, but it has become other sports. They do water sports. And she was just amazing to talk to. And the work that she's doing, the amount of work that she's doing to bring the next generation up is just incredible. And, until recently, it was all volunteer. She recently has gotten grants and became the president and quit her job and stuff.
Oh, wow. That's impressive.
Yeah, super impressive.
If our listeners want to follow you online, where can they find you? HearHerSports.com is the website for the podcast, and they can listen to all the podcasts from the website. But of course, it is also available on all of the podcast players. I do have social media, but that tends to be just a way to find out when the next episode is posted and a little bit online. All right. So just go to the website. Well, I would love for you to follow and I have a newsletter, and I love a good newsletter. So you can sign up for that at the website. And I talk about the episodes and the guests, but also sort of, one of the things that I have after all of these years talking to the athletes is an incredible perspective to be able to see the breadth of women I've talked to and to be able to make connections about, what they've talked about and their different sports. And so oftentimes I talk about that, and I talk about how the episode relates to things that are going on in the world. They're not as long as I just made it sound, but
well, that's really interesting. It's been great talking with you today, Elizabeth. I really appreciate you joining us, and thank you so much.
No, I thank you. Thanks for the time.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Anytime.
Bye.
Elizabeth's had so many insights about female athletes. I didn't realize she'd been podcasting for so long and following the stats and everything. I really never thought about the stats and how they don't keep track of women athletes. So that's another reason why people can't follow it as much, because you don't have ways to compare things if the statistics aren't kept.
Yeah, that was interesting. And also how broadcasters, commentators speak about women athletes as opposed to male athletes. I mean, I knew there was a difference in coverage, but I never really thought about the language used, though it makes sense.
Right. The language, the tone. I mean, you could tell that when you're listening to them.
Yeah. One of the things I meant to ask her about and we didn't get to it, I guess, was how many sports have women in very scanty outfits. And I know there's been some things in the Olympics where the women have protested their costume, their uniforms.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just thought that was, right. I was thinking about it when I was watching golf over the weekend, because the men all wear normal pants, shorts, shirts, and the women golfers all wear really short skirts. And I don't know. It's interesting.
Well, and I think even after performance, the questions that get asked to women compared to the questions that get asked to men, or, if those same questions were asked to men, everybody would be like, what?
Right. I just heard a female triathlete, I think, said, no one asks the men trained athletes how they handle having a family with their training.
Who's doing the daycare or whatever. Yeah. Everybody asks the guys who's watching the kids. But no, she, all of those races that she did, man, I was just in awe. The Tour de France.
I know. That was amazing.
Amazing.
And then her comment about how different the fueling has changed since then to now. And I think that makes sense, but it was interesting to think about going out and riding that race without having all of these.
Right. On a full stomach of eggs and bacon or whatever it is.
Yeah. That was interesting.
Right. Yeah. The liquid fuel and so many other things that they've learned has really made a difference. And I was surprised when I learned that Elizabeth's in Cleveland, Ohio. She's basically a neighbor of ours.
I know. That was funny. I am definitely going to listen to more of her podcast. I think talking to women of all ages really widens her perspective, and I'd sort of like to listen to more.
Right. Hey, to all of our listeners, please let us know what you thought about today's episode, or just let us know how you're doing on keeping fit and strong.
Yes, leave us a message at becomingellie.com, or you can find us as Becoming Ellie on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Pinterest, YouTube, and LinkedIn.
It was great talking with you today, Jill. I'm looking forward to the next episode of the Fit Strong Women Over 50 podcast.
I am too. See you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.